it as participative and embodied as possible, holding up a palm, holding up a bowl of water, creating sacred space. But now that we're on YouTube, even when I'm at home and I sit on a comfortable chair like this and sit back, it does feel like I'm watching the service. So there are certainly challenges like that that we're going to name. I wonder if, as we move forward, we will be needing to create specific liturgies for digital space that are different than live streaming, but that's going to take some time, but we'll probably hear a little bit of that from Jason. What I can say from my experience is that when I listen to people, many people do experience the sacred online, and I have to receive the comments that we are hearing, even if my preference is for embodied, multi-sensory liturgy. My whole ministry, as many of yours, has been about that. I'm trying to change along with the world and make sense of how we move forward. So one of my questions is, what is the nature of assembly? If we are providing hybrid options for the Sunday morning liturgy, are they all equal? Is Facebook Live equal to YouTube, equal to Zoom? I think that's an important question. What will new interactive participative realities might emerge? And my last thought is, we used to say the word virtual reality, but people are claiming that it's real when you're online. So is that even the best word? So with that, I will now return to panelist Liv, who will share some opening thoughts with you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being here on Wednesday of Institute of Liturgical Studies 2022. I give thanks that we are here and that all of your bodies are here, and I give thanks for those joining us from their places. So as Craig said, I serve a brick and mortar church. However, even that is reaching and expanding, but we are located in a neighborhood of Spokane, Washington. That's in eastern Washington, 40 miles from the Idaho border. So not rainy Seattle, but high desert and dry. And in our mission statement for the 12 years and actually preceding me, the years that I've been serving there, we speak our mission statement as we dismiss from Sunday worship. And we name our neighborhood. So we say, seeking and celebrating the presence of God for the life of the world, beginning in West Central Spokane. And that's been a hugely formative, rooting thing for us to do. And I wanted to share my context, a few of the innovations that I actually grumpily usually went about with maybe joy after the first year of this. And then finally, I have a couple hopes to name, but that what first innovation, maybe even the first Sunday of shutdown, was I added a line to that mission statement. So beginning in West Central Spokane and reaching to every corner where we are. So that was how we spoke our mission statement. And that has remained. And I think that's a gain, a gift. So the handful of innovations that our congregation took on is Sunday morning became Service of the Word and was shared via Facebook Live. We all experienced the beginning of this during Lent, and that Lenten season we had embraced Thursday Compline prayer. So that too went on Facebook Live, and particularly Compline has grown its own online community. We are now in person as well, but Compline is now kind of really asking the question for my community, what is a hybrid worshiping community? And it centers on that Thursday evening service. All of a sudden though, I was leading 2 services a week rather than 1. So just naming that the energy expenditure isn't nothing. It's not simply like turning a computer on, right? You don't know this. Yeah. Thanks. Another innovation that I took on before vaccinations were occurring, but as I think I heard Paul D'Amico Carper in his session say, you know, we were innovating thinking, oh, this interminable time of 2 to 6 weeks. And I'm like, aha, So, um, so as I think late summer, fall 2020 came around, and again, I'm in Eastern Washington, high desert. So another factor for us when we think like pandemic is a climate change issue that, so July and August can be terrible for us to be outside. And sometimes the air is unbreathable and it can be scary because of fires. Yeah, forest fire, thank you. And so once fire season subsided, I took up Eucharist in the park. And I plotted my congregation based on geography around the city of Spokane. And we're blessed with a lot of good and well-maintained green spaces. So I just set up a rotation and you could meet in these various parks. And so that was Sunday afternoon. And I gotta reach back in my memory. Well, what did we do? But we set out the bread and I had households like almost sign up. And then I set out a place for a guest just in case somebody in the park thought, oh, look, Christians are gathering. I want to eat with them. I don't think it ever happened, but I was just prepared. And then I had people bring their own cup, and I massed, came around with wine. And that became a special, as we were reaching out digitally, we were kind of like reaching in or reaching down to our place with that innovation. So that's what I'll share about what we did. And then I think my hope, like for this conversation, for the growth and development of our ministry from this point, I loudly heard Dr. Berger say in her plenary this morning that quick fixes are usually not good fixes. And I felt convicted by that. I'm like, ooh. So like, as we've all adapted, we've done our best. I think that also needs to really be said, that like a lot of these conversations have been laden with like shame and condemnation. It's like everybody's out here doing their best to love God and love their people. So thanks be to God for all of us and all the innovations we took on, so that the ongoing work would be slow and intentional and deeply contextual, and that we would like free ourselves up from thinking that every parish has to do all the things, but to like hear the Spirit speaking in all our places to say like, maybe this is your thing, maybe this is your thing. Hallelujah.
Deanna.
Hi, good to be with all of you. Thanks so much, Craig, for the invitation, and lovely to be with my fellow panelists. I am not a parish pastor, although my father's pastor, grandfather, 2 uncles. So I have some connection to that, but I'll say a little bit about why this has become an issue that I write about and speak about. And I used to be what I called a digital skeptic in the late 2000s, didn't own a cell phone, was really self-righteous about that I didn't own a cell phone. My kids didn't have cell phones. I was also very self-righteous about that fact. And then in December of 2008, I was diagnosed with stage 4 incurable breast cancer. And the cancer broke my back. I went immediately into the hospital. Most people don't live very long with the kind of cancer that I have. The day I got diagnosed, when I was in the hospital, my brother came. I was on a lot of oxycodone, and he said, I'm going to set up a Caring Bridge website for you. And I tell people, if I hadn't been on so much oxycodone, I would have said, no, don't do that. I don't believe that that's helpful. And very quickly, I was shown that this form of digital virtual support can really be life-saving. And so people started to hear about my story in a much faster way than they would have heard about it without the internet. I have a friend, Ralph Jacobson, who's also written about living with cancer before the internet, living with cancer after the internet. He said, I'd much rather have cancer after the internet for the kind of support that is possible that way. Because of the kind of support me and my family experienced through Caring Bridge, through other a digital way to sign up for doing our laundry and for bringing meals to our family. I started to think about the community that was surrounding us as the virtual body of Christ. This is a term I started to use. I wrote a Theo memoir about living with cancer where I have a chapter called Embraced by the Virtual Body of Christ. And then I came across a few years later an article by Jason Biasi talking about virtual theological education. And he made the observation that the body of Christ has always been a virtual body, that Paul was almost never physically with those he considered members, fellow siblings in the body of Christ, and his presence with those communities was virtual through the form of a letter being read out loud, performed sometimes as part of that gathering. And that was, Biasi used the term virtual body of Christ and connected to me very much to what I had been thinking about with my own shocking experience, that I could experience the hands and feet of Christ virtually. Was a real, it challenged my very incarnationally focused theology. One other insight from Biasi that I found really helpful was that he said, in some ways, Paul's virtual presence through those letters was woefully inferior to physical presence. And then he said, and in other ways, it was superior. And I think that for me was also a really important insight, because there are, of course, when I was really sick, there's no way that anyone can virtually rub my feet or virtually take me to the doctor. But so there were ways in which it was an inferior form of care. At the same time, one of the things that surprised me the most, and this is being the daughter of a pastor who saw him do a lot of pastoral care with people over the decades, that sometimes it was way better to be ministered to virtually. And this is something I never would have understood. But when your body looks like it's dying, when your body doesn't work the way it's supposed to, it can sometimes just be too much to be with other people in person. This is an insight I did not know. I would have said it is always better to be in person. So I had a kind of what I call conversion experience to the potential positive power of virtual connectedness to help us live out our vocation as members of the body of Christ, thinking about 1 Corinthians 12 in particular, that the weakest members of the body deserve special attention. These digital tools, I think, can really help us attend to the weakest members of the body. So I started spreading that gospel before the pandemic. Wasn't always met with a real positive response by people really saying, virtuality is not real. It's a far inferior form of being connected. Had a lot of good, healthy debates about this. And then the pandemic hit, and these questions came with a kind of urgency that they hadn't before. One bishop said, we had at least a decade where we could have been theologizing much more robustly about virtuality, and we really, other than people like Teresa Berger and a few others who really did this really thoughtfully, we didn't spend our time doing a lot of robust theological thinking about virtuality. One of the things I heard shortly after the pandemic is, since we're not able to gather, and I think here again is where virtuality, I think especially early on, was assumed to be not real, since we can't gather in person. But we were gathering online, and I had people tell me, Palm Sunday, we were walking around our living rooms with palms, an embodied experience. Another person told me, I fell on my knees during online worship in my living room. The pastor, it feels like he's preaching just to me, and I cry every time I have a sermon. I am part of that online worship experience. So I also want to challenge the claim that virtuality is disembodied. It's a different way of being embodied and being connected, but it definitely has quite a bit to do with how we are bodies. So just a couple kind of thinking about this gathering Rite, and I don't have all the answers, and I'm not daily thinking about this. I'm in the classroom, so I'm thinking about that, and I would say learned how to do teaching in person well, then learned how to do fully remote well. The hybrid is by far the hardest. that is the juggernaut. But one of the things too that as Craig mentioned, I ended up kind of jumping into the virtual communion fray, and that was also not a lifelong dream of mine to become a national spokesperson for virtual communion. And the thing I wrote talked about the theological permissibility, not as Liv was saying, that this is all of us need to now do this, but talking about it as a permissible thing. One of the things that pushed me into that conversation was a lot of people bringing up we should not do it because it's not accessible to everybody. Now, this is a very important point, accessibility in terms of computer access, all of this. But the thing that kind of got me going a bit was that I felt like accessibility has always been a really big issue in terms of weekly worship. And if we're only going to talk about accessibility when it comes to people's access to computers, that is not really talking about accessibility. So as someone who got really sick and wasn't able to go to worship, I know we have provisions for visiting homebound members. Homebound, also not a great term, but people who can't make it to church. That is a great thing to have on paper. It doesn't always happen in practice. So accessibility is a really important issue there. We're not really as much focused there on caregivers. Caregivers' accessibility to worship is a really important thing. Transportation, some of our congregations are awesome at figuring out who needs to get to church and when and how to do it. But there are a lot of congregations where transportation is not an accessible place. In terms of disability and access to congregational spaces. We are now not in our congregation in our sanctuary worshiping because we're doing a renovation to make it more accessible. So if we want to talk about accessibility, I hope we will, that is a huge category that goes far beyond internet access. And then one thing I'd love for us to think about in our preview conversation, Jason mentioned not just online church, but church, online. So like, what does it mean to be the church in this digital age? And what does that look like? And my experience of being ministered to virtually when in-person visits were just too excruciating. Again, I want to be really clear. I'm not saying, now we should just, as pastoral care, send a text, and it's all good. But I think what I really think the question I want us to think about is how can these tools help us better be the body of Christ? And when we're ministering to people, for instance, whose bodies are undone, whose lives are undone, how can these tools be gifts that help us do better what we're called to do as members of the body of Christ?
Thank you. And lastly, Jason.
Hi. So I think that we are in the midst of a pretty major shift into digital culture. So rest in peace, Phyllis Tickle. She talked about these garage sales, these rummage sales every 500 years. And we're due, and we're in the midst of it right now. So we are right now shifting to a digital culture. And that's going to take a while. I feel like March 2020 kind of, started that train or made it go even faster, but we've been in the midst of it since the end of the 20th century. And so I've just been very interested in I've been curious about how do we do that? How do we follow Jesus in this new digital landscape? And recognizing, I think that as Dr. Deanna, I want to call you Dr. Deanna now. I didn't know you were Dr. That's great. Dr. Deanna said that there are times that digital worship and digital means of connecting with God can be superior. And I've been really interested in the ways that we can do that, because all I've ever heard really is, well, digital is not That's not what we want to do. That's always going to be bad. It's always going to be less than. And so how do we at least get it up to the same level as face-to-face interaction when it's like, yo, this is apples and oranges, right? Like, why are we trying to compare these two? They're different. They're totally different. And so how do we focus on the good parts of both? I just want to say that when I was my first call as a parish pastor, I suggested that maybe we had our monthly newsletter that was mailed out to people, that it become a PDF. And you would have thought that I suggested that we don't worship the resurrected Christ anymore, or that I'm trying to replace it in some way, as opposed to what I was really hoping to do, which is say that, like, that's my 2 minutes, that the digital aspects of what we're walking into right now, they don't have to be opposed to the face-to-face interactions. They can be together, and that can be actually really beautiful.
Thank you. So now we are going to poll the audience, poll the community here. So it's old-fashioned. It's not on your phone. It's this. Raise your hand. Those in the front want to turn around and look so you can see the results, because otherwise I'm not going to give any. You're just going to see them. You may raise your hand as many times as it applies. How many of your congregations have done pre-recorded liturgies? How many have been on YouTube? How many have been on Facebook Live? How many have changed since you started? Oh, I'm sorry. And how many Zoom? And how many of you are still doing the same portal that you were before? Like if you started on Zoom, you're still on Zoom. All right. And how many of your congregations fasted from the Eucharist until you were able to meet inside the building? All right. And how many of you with Liv had opportunities for communion outside? And how many provided either drive-in or a drive-through option for communion? All right. And how many of you emphasized the delivery of, for lack of a better word, consecrated elements to people in the congregation? That bread and wine from the Sunday that was consecrated previously was delivered to homes or delivered to people. Can we see those hands again? Some? Mm-hmm. And how many offered communion online in some form? All right. How many of you would say that compared to over 2 years ago, your mind has changed on some of these elements we're talking about today? So I think we've already moved us there, but we want to hold gently that we've all been doing the best we can without, we weren't in denominations where bishops absolutely forbid or absolutely gave permission. And so there was a lot more experimentation than perhaps the Episcopal and Roman Catholic churches, where it was just declared what you could or couldn't do. And if a church did online communion, suddenly they were told by the bishop to stop. So we need to know that for better or worse, those of us who have been Lutheran have experienced a great diversity among our peers and our neighbors, and we want to just acknowledge that things happen quickly, and we can tell already that there's a good spirit of being open to what we've learned from one another. All right, so time has gone by so quickly, which means you may want to come to part 2 for more, but we only have about half our time left. I'm going to ask the panelists and all of us to be brief with our answers. We're going to move through some topics because our goal is not to solve anything. We are raising questions today, and our main point is that there's not one answer for a gathering right, that we're trying to learn and live into many different answers from each other. So one question would be up here with the panel: can you name a way your mind has changed since the pandemic? Because each of you may have come in. Jason, remember, had done much digital work. Deanna had already written her book on the virtual body of Christ. Liv had come to this conference for many, many years and had strong commitments about embodied liturgy. So we all came with our own preconceived commitments. Anybody want to say how your mind has changed since the pandemic on some of these topics?
Well, I'll say that I wasn't into online communion. I wasn't. I was like, we're in the Babylonian captivity of Eucharist until we come back together. And then like 2021 happened. And then like 2022. I'm like, okay, maybe. But even then, I'm not sold on it. I just say that to say, like, I'm the digital person in some areas. And it's like, I still felt like that was something that could only be done in person. And I've changed because it's kind of what you said, Craig, in terms of like embodied multi-sensory worship. I think multi-sensory worship and embodied worship can happen digitally. It just takes some time to formulate that with the people who are going to be gathering, right? To take some time to say, hey, we're in this together. So like light a candle and like bring down the lights and maybe light some incense if that's something you can do. Like we need your help to make this a holy space. Because I can show you what a holy space looks like, but I can't make you smell what I'm burning, or I can't make you, right? I can't make you experience all that. So you got to do some of that work.
So you work with 2 digital communities. Can you say more about how you think about that or how you experiment with, because that's a big question for those of us who are committed to that. How can a liturgy at home not seem solitary and not be just watching a screen?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if you think about like show of hands, have you seen a movie that's kind of changed the way that you've thought about life? Has it kind of okay? So you've watched something on a screen that's had an impact on you. What? So like there are ways you can watch the screen and be impacted, right? Now, the screen's doing a lot of the work. So like, and maybe you saw it in a theater and you were around other people. Oh man, I was trying to think the last time I did that. And like, we all wanted to watch the show together. And so there's like this connection. But if you're alone, there's still ways that like that screen can, if you're thinking of it as like, this is going to be a good 30 or 40 minutes, that's going to be really powerful. And if you bring that intention in, even if you're alone, I mean, I'm just thinking about, I live alone, I'm single, and I've done a lot of these kind of worship services where I'm completely alone. And it's like, in some ways, especially if I can make some room in my own space, if I can, again, I'm gonna say light candles, if there are other ways that you can do that like allow you to enter into the fact that, yeah, you're gonna be watching a screen, but also watching a screen can sometimes be really powerful if you're in the right mindset, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question, Craig?
Certainly. Other ways your mind has changed?
My mind and spirit changed a bit about what skills I was willing to build. In March and April of 2020, I think I needed like a 2-hour walk around my neighborhood to like get out my grumps from having to preach to a screen. I was not happy. But I built some skills. And then the other thing that I really learned is that the community has the capacity to build skills, to build and to maintain the community through various technologies. And our people have the capacity to try new things and learn about each other and then discern. And so like I recall our congregation sort of after a few months discerned that our 2 highest priorities in terms of mission and ministry were economic justice and remaining connected. And like everything else would kind of just go on hold. But that we used Zoom meetings, for example, to have those conversations and to do the work of discernment. So like I so hear and appreciate the thought of like, yes, we've watched something that moves us, but I I remain really hoping that congregations are places where community is built. And I hear you saying that that is a community building thing as well. I will also confess that like when I hear Jason say like the future is digital, that I'm like, not enough of you have watched the horror movies when the robots revolt and like take over. Like, aren't you terrified? And I'm like,
I have.
Okay.
I don't think it's a good thing always,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Just I think I love the talk about like, you know, Paul and Luther and like using the tools that are here for us. And I think I want to ask and wonder like, what about times when the tools aren't benign? So because you name Zoom, Facebook Live, YouTube, like those are corporations with their own goals. It doesn't mean we can't like, that's not an absolute answer at all. It's just like another question. So
Let's go with that and stay with the lens of Kyries and Glorias and lost.
revolting robots.
Let's think about some things to celebrate or things to grieve that are happening now in the subjects that we're talking about, including what do we celebrate? What are some opportunities? We've named some already, but some others that you'd like to name that we celebrate or that we grieve in the current moment as we move to a more digital culture, as Jason said. Deanna.
Yeah, I think pre-pandemic, the conversations weren't very nuanced about how to use digital technology. And if we try to think about ways in which that is superior versus ways in which it's inferior, this is where I am super interested to hear from all of you in congregations about what have you learned about how these tools can help you better be the body of Christ. I know in our church, we've had a number of people come to new member services online, join our church with ever having set foot in the physical building. And, you know, one of them came to our house. We did a 10-week, in summer of 2020, we did 10 weeks of a Bible study in our backyard along a lot of different small groups in our church met outside. And we had a young single woman, 28 years old, hospice nurse who had been raised in the church, came to Minneapolis to start her career, felt like I should find a church, and then didn't get around to it, or it wasn't a high enough priority until the pandemic hit. Being a hospice nurse, she was like, I have to have a community. And she told me about coming to our church via Zoom. And she said it was so much less intimidating to click a Zoom link than it would be for me as a young single person to walk into your church alone. And I thought, okay, so this seems to be an opportunity to think about how these digital tools can help us better be the body of Christ. And I think a lot about the issue of people being alone in terms of the virtual communion piece. For me, that is, I know a lot of people who are alone, this is hard for them, even though they want to partake. I think at the same time, we have a lot of people in our congregations who are maybe never coming back to church before the end of their life. This is part of my pastoral sense of that the virtual communion can be really an important thing. And that was especially when we didn't have access to each other as easily as we're having now. But how do we, in this hybrid environment too, how do we provide opportunities for connections? You know, one of the things you miss, I taught fully online in 2021. In some ways, way better attendance in Zoom online classes than in-person classes. And that can be a benefit to the students that they're there in class much more often. You know, how can we provide opportunities for people to connect? One of the things we miss online are all those side conversations. And those are conversations where you ask about how someone's mom is doing through the chemo that she's having. You ask, you know, and chat. I mean, some people are very adept at chat and can be doing that. But that can be really limited. So are there ways for those people who are not able to come back to church or don't feel comfortable coming back because of being immunocompromised, or how can we think about providing opportunities for people to connect to one another? So I think we have tools that can help us do things that we haven't done before. And I think now is the time to start to get to talk with one another, have robust conversations about this part. Really doesn't seem to be a great place to use our digital tools. This place really seems like a really helpful opportunity. And so I think that's what I worry about. And I see this, I'm at St. Olaf, they call themselves an intensely residential community. So all classes are back in person because you shouldn't be online because that's inferior. I feel like definitely a lot of worship spaces, a lot of our churches we need to get back in person because that's always superior. How do we just get more nuanced in our thinking about that? That's what I'm really interested in, because we learned some things through this about how to use these tools and how to use them well.
And there's, as Liv said, in terms of like, there's a lot of digital tools. They are not automatically good. Like Carl Sagan said that we became technological before becoming wise about the technology. Like we're adolescents, all of us, in this digital age. And so as the digital age continues to, as we move through it, like this is new to us. And so we gotta recognize, and there's a lot of things that are problematic about what happens online. We, with Slate Project, do a Thursday evening conversation on Twitter. Twitter, love you, Twitter. And Twitter has now been bought by a guy who had $44 billion to spare because he was the richest guy in the world. Now he owns it. So like that's problematic, right? Like, and we're here. Like the train has left the station. We're not going back. So my question is, how do we recognize both that some of this could go really bad? I'm just thinking about any season from Black Mirror. Some of these things could go real bad, real quick. And I still want to fight for this. We can still use this. We can't go back to some like pre-technological past. As much as I would love for that to happen, it's not going to happen. So how do we do it now? You know what I'm saying?
Is it Adrienne Marie Brown who invites us to think now about the skills we will need in the apocalypse? Sorry, but like,
don't be sorry. That's real.
Did you where you came to the first plenary, right? It's Church in the Apocalypse, and I think, yeah, I'm so glad that Dr. Gianna and Jason, we're talking about. Okay, Gianna, but like you're centering us on like well, it's about being the body of Christ, and so like a value being access, like needs to be informed by being the body of Christ. I think the thing I grieve is that like as we talk and work on that, it also, I mean, we're human and we're not always that centered. So what you can't tack your way to being like a more loving or just or merciful community, but the tools can serve the goals of love and justice and mercy. But like, that's harder, deeper work. But we should put all the things in. Like, it's also helpful to remember that like people were really anxious when like the printing press made all the books and people thought, oh no, are people just going to stare down at their book? Like every technology has been met with questions, and it's been all caught in.
They wish they go back to the way it was before when people just talk to you, right? Sorry, I'm just.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going to go down another street now. How many of you saw the New York Times editorial by Tish Harrison Warren, Why Churches Should Drop Their Online Services? All right, so she said that people need touch and physical interaction. Here's what I want us to talk about, starting with Liv. Online church makes embodiment elective for some, not for all, but for some, and it becomes about convenience. So those of us who lead churches wonder about that, that we can opt in or out with little consequence. Liv, tell us a little bit of why that word convenience stuck with you. Yes, sorry.
No, we had, I think, spoken about this. A little part of me dies. And it's like they can just watch it whenever they want. I'm like, "Oh, what? But I would not also say that embodiment is elective. I think that's gone too far. I think, but it's on us leaders, and it's on all of us to send and say the value is care, the value is building community, and I need to be called out of my what is easy for me. I mean, we are absolutely needing to address things like our climate and white supremacy, and that's not going to be easy. So I think, yeah, we can vocally say that convenience is not the goal. The goal is what is our community's particular role in taking care of each other and offering care to the world, for the life of the world.
I'm going to let each of you respond, but as I think about my congregation, I have a sense that there are people on both ends, some who never could do anything online, never did online worship and came back when it was in person. And then others who seem to only be online now and aren't coming back. And then I think there's this middle, like, well, honey, should we go in person today or should we go online? And there are more opportunities. So is this a good or a bad thing or both? To our other two panelists.
I think this is a great question. And just to complicate it a little bit more too, I had a conversation recently with somebody who's interested in doing a fully virtual church and just thinking about that. And one of the things she brought up in response to the Tish Harrison Warren piece is that the people she's spending time with in digital context say that the pandemic has so changed them that they're not going to go back, that they are different people. And so I wonder too, if digital worship options are going to be for people in some cases. I do think in some cases it's absolutely convenience. I mean, we're human. There are multiple reasons why people access all of this. Right. So that's important. It's not just convenience. That would be quite offensive, actually, as someone who's been really seriously ill. It's like not just a convenience issue. There's a bunch of other things going on. But I found that a really interesting perspective, that the people that this particular pastor is talking to says, we've changed. And this form of being church, being a Christian is a form I don't see myself ever returning to. Now, I don't think that's the majority of people who've been church going, but I found it a really interesting point, and it may also be a place they're at now that they won't always be at. And so I think the digital worship as a legitimate form of being church is going to be really important. And I think people are sorting out who they are emerging from pandemic. What are the rituals that were grounding to them? Are they the same going forward? I mean, I think all of us are going out to eat. Is that going to be something we do in the way we did it before? Is going to a concert live going to be what we did before? I mean, we just have all of these patterns of our lives that have been really disrupted. So I wonder about some, which I didn't see in Tish Harrison Warren's piece, is some grace for people who are trying to figure out what life looks like in this new space. And what is it? And I think that participating in online worship can be a part of someone's faith life. It can be an important part of someone's faith life. And that may not be where they stay. So I think that's another important piece, is that, and we're seeing it. I'm back in person every week at my home church. I advocate for all the digital stuff, and I'm there in person every week. And it's fascinating to me how many people I know who are part of our community who I don't ever see now in person. And part of that makes me really sad. Part of me just wonders what the future looks like. But that hearing from this other pastor made me think that we also probably really need a sorting out time and that people didn't have a choice, went from fully online to now they have a choice, and there's a lot of other things in their life that they're trying to sort out as well. So I think we want to not make pronouncements about what has this is totally changed, because I think we're still in this figuring out period.
I think we're asking a lot of questions about digital worship once we started doing it. Like, how can somebody, like, how do we know then they're watching the computer and not like going to do something else on their computer at the same time, right? Or like, how do we know if they're really engaged? It seems really lonely if you're just alone watching a screen. And I'm like, these are all valid questions. I would love it if we asked them of face-to-face worship too, because I've been in many face-to-face worships where I'm incredibly alone and lonely. I've been in places where I've been preaching from the pulpit or in the aisles, where I've watched people making notes. They're making their grocery lists, y'all. They're not on their computer. They're not on their phone. Like, I've seen people on their phone giving money to the church and people writing down things that they're not paying attention to me at all. So we have these assumptions. And the New York Times article really does that every time we come together in person, it's incredible and embodied and beautiful. And I can't wait. I don't ever want to leave. And it's like, really? I've been in churches where I can't wait to leave because I've been treated like crap, or because it's a family that I don't belong to. Oh, we're a family here, except for me. But I can click a Zoom link and I can be welcomed from my computer, even if I live entirely alone. That's a miracle. So, I mean, there's some bright lights, I think.
So we're nearly out of time. We're not going to focus, obviously, today on online communion. That would have been a very fascinating but difficult conversation. But I just want to hold up a book. There's only one book that's come out on this that I've just read the last 2 weeks and devoured. And I was fascinated because the author is an Anglican and talked about it from the perspective of the Church of England. And it's actually Whitford-Stock, and I think they'll give you a discount there, even though there are no more left. Holy Communion in Contagious Times by Richard Burridge. The reason I think it's a great book, he goes through all the different, goes through Zoom and fasting and spiritual communion and all the different things that have been done, analyzes them, and then tells his own experience, where he was part of a midweek communion of different denominations and people ordained in the Church of England that did communion on Zoom, and how he experienced the presence of Christ through that, but then struggles with what does that mean liturgically and with consecration and with real presence. So even those who are hesitant, like Rowan Williams and our own Michael Curry of the Episcopal Church here, say to read this book because at least it's going to help you understand from a different perspective by analyzing all the different modalities, what we should be continuing to talk about for the next years and decades. I think I'm going to see what residue thoughts any of the three of you have left as we conclude today, knowing we'll continue at 3, but something you haven't had a chance to say yet that you've been percolating with. Starting with Liv.
I really want to just appreciate Jason's turn and to interrogate, like, these questions should have been applied to in-person gatherings this whole time. And like, I've been a part of Glimmers here where we have interrogated those practices. So yeah, just coming back to center. And I think coming back to values, and like, so I'm challenged to embrace choice. Just because, like, I know I will make the wrong choices, and I need a body who will say, you need to be in this Zoom conversation for these many reasons, or you need to be here in this room for these many reasons, like, because this is work we're going to do in whatever way. So yeah, both that the deep grace and also calling in and challenge.
I think I would say that go back to what I was talking about in the workshops that I did, which are vocations that we don't choose, how to come to terms with those. I know none of you in the church, leading our churches, envisioned the pandemic, envisioned having to do all the things that you did, having a vocation put on you that you maybe didn't want, that you didn't choose, you didn't like in a lot of ways. This is not what you envisioned going into ministry would look like. And I would just say, bless you for the work that you've done in this time and the way that you've responded to this call. That happens in many of our lives, that these things come that we wouldn't have ever wished for. And then how do we live into them and accept that this is, I was using a quote, I used several quotes from Frederick Buechner, but the last one, he says, God calls me to this, but not to that. And many times we wish we were called to that and not this. So continued blessings to you as you understand you're called to this as we figure out what this looks like.
Yeah, a mighty fortress is our God, not our church buildings. I think we can name that and we can understand it theologically, but then this digital culture is making us kind of look it in the face, because maybe some of our churches will close and have already closed during this pandemic. And there are ways that we have to gather outside of the church building, which I would say the early Christians were like, welcome.
Many more topics we did not get to that will occur at 3 o'clock. Thank you for joining us on the couch for this conversation. And let us thank our panel.